Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks so much for being here. We are entering a phase of our country's existence where might makes right. That's bad. And I want to talk about how we got here. So, ready to go on this journey together here? Let's first start with some truths of human nature. This is from Richard Wrangham. He's an evolutionary biologist and anthropologist. He wrote a book called The Goodness Paradox. He says, we are inclined to label callously planned violence, such as the Holocaust, as inhumane. But it's not inhumane at all. It's deeply human. No other mammal has such a deliberate approach to mass killing of its own species. Interesting point. So we say something like the Holocaust or a genocide or even mass murders in the streets of Chicago every week, and we say it's inhumane. Right? It's inhuman. It's not human, what we're doing. But no, they're actually, things like this are uniquely human. They're not human. It's uniquely human. The opposite is true. Now, this is no surprise if you read the Bible. By the way, human nature is the most important thing to talk about. All of this is human nature. If you understand human nature, you understand everything that's going on and everything that's to come. This is Romans 3:9. Read this yesterday. There's no one right. These are all quoting Old Testament scriptures. There's no one righteous, not even one. No one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They become together worthless. There's no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. How about that? But what they say is as disgusting as an open grave. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways. And the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. That's human nature. There's a new American Christianity view of human nature, that humans are great and wonderful and so good. And blah, blah. No. Humans are wretched and horrible. All right, third point about human nature. This is a professor of sociology who studies mobs, mob mentality. He has this term called mobbing, and he wrote specifically about this in the workplace. But this is true in schools, and it's true in politics as well. It's just human nature. He says, a mobbing is an impassioned collective campaign by coworkers to exclude, punish, and humiliate a targeted worker. Initiated most often by a person in a position of power or influence, mobbing is a desperate urge to crush and eliminate its target. Do you see this going on today in America? You are the target, by the way. The urge travels through the workplace like a virus, infecting one person after another. The target comes to be viewed as absolutely abhorrent, with no redeeming qualities. Outside the circle of acceptance and respectability, deserving only contempt. And as the campaign proceeds, a steadily larger range of hostile ploys and communications come to be seen as legitimate. That's you, right? That's you as a conservative in America today. Now, this article goes through a bunch of examples that we're not going to do today of people who have been mobbed in the workplace, mostly in academia for going against the orthodoxy, but in other aspects of just normal existence as well. And they're terrible. You lose your identity, you lose your livelihood, the ways to provide for your family. You lose your connections, your contacts. It's an excommunication. It's modern day excommunication. This is an article from Quillette from 2 years ago. It's called The Academic Mob and Its Fatal Toll. And the same thing goes through a bunch of different examples of this happening, mostly in academia. But this is the key line here. No matter how educated or enlightened a person may think they are, because I know you're thinking, I would never do any of these things. So this isn't me. I'm better than that. We're better than that. Our country's better than that. No, we're not. What do you think that quote out of the Bible only applied to people thousands of years ago, and now we're so much better? We've evolved to be so much better today? Come on. We're just as bad, just as evil, just as rotten as we've always been, just as fallen. So no matter how educated or enlightened a person may think they are, when faced with the primal nature of a mobbing, most people will betray their own principles and move to and here's the key, the safety of power. People move to safety. Where is safety? Safety comes from those who are in power. Yesterday we talked to David Arsani, and he made such a good point about freedom of speech. We're talking about freedom of speech. And he said, yeah, we have a constitutional principle of freedom of speech, but it's only worth anything if there's also a value that underpins it in our country. Think of it like a freedom of speech is like a fiat currency, right? This money that we have, like cash, if you don't value it, if we just all collectively decide not to value it, it's not worth anything, right? And the same thing with freedom of speech. If we don't value it, then it doesn't exist, right? If we don't all decide freedom of speech is an important thing, then it's gone. And this is my point. If you don't value freedom of speech, then what you do value is might makes right. Because that's how it's always worked in our uncivilized world. It's always been might makes right. Power wins. The mob wins. Only recently have we had these values that protect the minority. If we don't value freedom of speech, then what we really value is might makes right. To prove that, this is why the big tech companies never go after China. China's big. China's powerful. China has a lot of money. They never go after China, but they go after you. So when every principle is tossed aside in the name of power, right? If we as a society go from trying to find out what are the best principles, right? And who is the most principled, if we don't do that anymore, then instead it becomes a power game again. Who has the most power? And what's the crudest form of power? Violence. It took us a long time as human beings to come out of the swamps of might makes right and into a civilization, into a constitutional republic that protects the rights of the minority. It's thousands of years in the making. If we abandon these principles, guess what we go back to? Nothing progressive. We go back to might makes right. The mob, which takes away the rights of that minority. A well-run civilization condemns violence. But then massive companies and massive institutions and many people throw aside principles like freedom of speech and instead replace it with a power game. And this is how the Marxists see the world entirely. Everything is about power. Everything is a power dynamic. Everything's a power battle. Everything. That's the Marxist view of the world. And if you take away the principles of how we should interact with each other and how we should view each other, tomorrow we're going to talk about how social media and big tech dehumanize people. If we continue that, if we get rid of that, then we start playing this Marxist game of everything's about power that inevitably leads to violence. Because if it's a power game, then it's I'll show you who really has the most power. I'll show you that I have the most power. How do you do that? Violence, ultimately. Make sense? So if you don't value freedom of speech, you by default value might makes right. And that's where we are right now. Because right now, there is a new war on terror, and this is my second point. There is a new war on terror happening right now, and you are the terrorist. Let me say that again, because you're thinking, I'm not a terrorist. I know you're not, but that doesn't matter. There's a new war on terror, and you're the terrorist. Let me prove it. This is Joe Biden in the Wall Street Journal. Don't dare call them protesters. They were a riotous mob, insurrectionist, domestic terrorists. It's that basic, it's that simple. We talked a lot about this yesterday, the escalation of rhetoric, and with our guest coming up here from the American Mind, the Claremont Institute, we're going to talk about language and the importance of it. It went from mob to riot to coup to insurrection. Now it's a terrorist attack, okay? That's what they're landing on right now. The only thing beyond that is genocide. Right? That's the only rhetorical escalation that's possible. I actually want to talk about that a little bit later, and here's Biden doing the same thing. It's an insurrection. It's a terrorist attack. These are domestic terrorists. You are a domestic terrorist. You're not someone with a different political opinion that we need to debate and have a conversation with and come to agreement on or come to a compromise. Or even, I won the election, so I hear what you're saying, but this is what we're going to do anyway. That's normal, right? This is, you're a domestic terrorist. I heard one congresswoman yesterday call it a white supremacist terrorist attack, okay? That's how they're framing this. Here's the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Biden said he makes plans to make a priority of passing a law against domestic terrorism. That's you. Federal law defines domestic terrorism as dangerous and illegal acts intended to coerce a population or influence the government. So the question is, what is dangerous? What's considered dangerous? I want to be clear, I'm not calling this a war on terror. Right? I know someone can misinterpret this or come right in the middle of this or whatever and say, I'm calling this a war on terror. No, I'm not calling this a war. The left is calling this a war on terror. And you're the terrorist. Why do I say that? That sounds dramatic. I say that because they're calling you terrorists. They're saying this was a terrorist attack committed by domestic terrorists. And we need a new war on terror. Now, there's three different levels here. This is Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald, he said, I spent the first decade of my career, my journalism career, devoted to exposing and denouncing the excesses of the first war on terror. And I see exactly the same tactics forming. If you question or are concerned about these new powers, you'll be branded as sympathetic to the terrorist, okay? So there's three levels of terrorism here. You're either the terrorist, okay? So you're like someone who goes to the rallies or whatever. You are, if you're not a terrorist, you're just below that is you're inciting terrorism. And then the third level is if you don't speak out against this enough to their liking, then you are sympathetic to the terrorists. So you're either the terrorist, you're inciting terrorism, or you're sympathetic to the terrorist. Either way, you're bundled up in the same group. This is a new congresswoman. Her name's Elisa Slotkin. She's a former CIA analyst, and here she is on MSNBC.
Can we just accept that the post 9/11 era is over? We are in a new era, right? We had a generational event with the infiltration of the Capitol, and the era of the primary threats to the United States being external, right? Threats coming from abroad, from foreign terrorist organizations, from China, from Russia. They're still serious, but the single greatest national security threat right now is our internal division. It's the threat of domestic terrorism. It's that polarization that threatens our democracy. And we've had a visual representation of that 2 days ago. So to me, yes, I'm worried about external threats, but when the Biden administration comes in, I urge them and everyone else to understand that the greatest threat to us now is internal. And if we do not do that work of trying to reconnect those two Americas, the threats are not going to have to come from outside. We're going to do it to ourselves. We're going to hurt ourselves. And I think that era of external threats is now surpassed by domestic threat.
Great. That's you. I don't know how to put the primal threat is internal, the single greatest threat. You threaten democracy. Now, you say, Slater, she's just talking about bringing people together. No, she's not. She's talking about polarization. It's the polarization that threatens our democracy. Polarization is democracy. The way they define democracy, it's whatever the Democratic Party wants. So anything that gets in that way is going to be categorized as a terrorist threat or inciting insurrection or sympathetic to terrorists. And someone may say, we need to do the work to unite America. That means purging the enemies because they're terrorists. That's you. Got to take a break. Come back. I want to talk about the Reichstag fire and how this was not, Trump had his opportunity. He didn't take it. The left did. Do that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to give the very short here of the Reichstag fire. The German government was split. The Nazi Party was actually losing power based on the last election. And there was a fire at their Capitol building, the Reichstag. Right? And Hitler used it to blame the communists. He said it was a communist insurrection. They didn't have the word terrorist back then, but I'm sure he would have used it. And said he used that fire as the excuse to take total control over the government and then obviously bring the Nazi party into power. And out of that, they passed the Reichstag fire decree. This is the main part of it that is relevant to us today. Articles 114, 15, 17, 18, 23, 24, 153 of the Constitution of the German Reich are suspended until further notice. It is therefore permissible to restrict the rights of personal freedom, freedom of expression, including the freedom of the press, the freedom to organize and assemble, the privacy of postal, telegraphic, and telephonic communications, warrants for house searches, orders for confiscations, as well as restrictions on property are also permissible beyond the legal limits otherwise prescribed. So Hitler said, I need total emergency powers to prevent a violent uprising from taking place. Do you see it? Do you see the parallels? Now, the left has called Trump, I don't need to spell it out anymore, right? We're tracking? The left has called Trump a tyrant and a dictator for 4 years, right? Constantly, for 4 years, they've been talking about how Trump will never leave office, right? Saying he's going to take absolute control and all this nonsense. He never did. And COVID was Trump's Reichstag moment. COVID was the justification that Trump needed to take federal control of everything if he wanted to. He never did. He left COVID, a lot of COVID stuff over to the states, rightfully so. COVID was his chance to take away your freedoms. He didn't. The Democratic governors did and still are. Trump could have used COVID as a justification to delay elections, right? Delay elections indefinitely. He never did. Trump did not take his Reichstag moment, Reichstag fire moment. Not because he couldn't, or because it's not like he tried and it didn't work. He didn't even try. It wasn't in his nature to do so. It wasn't in his thought process to do so. But what, 100 or 200? I wonder if we ever get a number out of this. How many people go crazy at the Capitol for an hour and it's the worst day in American history? Come on, get it together, people. Read an article in The Atlantic this morning comparing what happened last Wednesday to 9/11. And that goes back to our last segment. Who committed 9/11? Terrorists. See how that works? So we're comparing what happened on Wednesday to 9/11? 3,000 people were killed? Come on. Check out this video from Schwarzenegger.
I'm very aware of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. It was a night of rampage against the Jews carried out in 1938 by the Nazi equivalent of the Proud Boys. Wednesday was the day of broken glass right here in the United States. The broken glass was in the windows of the United States Capitol. But the mob did not just shatter the windows of the Capitol, they shattered the ideals we took for granted.
Give me a break, Arnold. The night of broken glass. Okay. Quick refresher here. This is 1938 in Germany. By the way, the only reason we're talking about this is to rebuke the people who are making these analogies. For the love of Pete, can someone come up with historical analogies other than a 20-year time period in Germany? Right? Like, there's a lot of other things that have happened in the world, but we always got to go back to Hitler and Germany. 1938, the brown shirts of the German military. Okay, so we're already way off with the analogy already, right? So this, like, imagine if Trump had the Navy SEALs attack the Capitol building. Okay, now we're talking coup. Instead, it was like that old lady with the flag. You've seen that old lady with the little American flag? Okay, so first of all, it was the German military who did it. Second of all, the depths of the attack of the Night of Broken Glass. They destroyed 267 synagogues, 7,000 Jewish businesses, 30,000 Jewish men were sent to concentration camps. 91 Jews were murdered, and it was so awful, it's believed over 600 Jews committed suicide afterwards. There is no comparison. What happened Wednesday to the Night of Broken Glass? And just another little aside, the left keeps saying that 5 people died from Wednesday's terrorist attack, and they have to inflate that number. It was 2 people, maybe 3. One of the police officers was killed. A woman from San Diego, where I am right now, was shot in the neck by a police officer. So those are like the two main ones. Another person was trampled by a crowd, but I don't know when or where, or under what circumstance, or what crowd, or what they were doing. Were they storming the Capitol? Was it beforehand? Was it after? Was it in a subway station? I don't know. Another died from a heart attack, and another died from a stroke. But that wasn't connected to, right? People die at concerts all the time. No one has a Jason Aldean death toll. Right? It's like, oh, Jason Aldean's coming to town. So far, 8 people have died at his, right? Like, but they have to say 5 people died. No, it was 2. 2 people died. But anyway, that's all part of the raising, right? It's all part of the misinformation, the raising of tension as opposed to decreasing it. Night of broken glass. Give me a break. So, what could Biden have done? He could have used this as an opportunity to unite the country. Could have been something like, listen, everyone, it's time we move past the last 4 years. What happened on Wednesday was bad. It was an exclamation point on a really tough time for this country, but it's no more. That's behind us. We got to come together now. So people on the left, you need to forgive the people on the right and embrace everyone as a fellow American. We talked the story the other day. We talked about Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. If they could shake hands and move forward as fellow citizens, so can we. People on the right, you didn't vote for me. You think I'm going to usher in communism. I'm not. I have some political reforms that I think will make our country better. There's some that I really think you will like. Some you won't, but I did win the election, so we're going to move the country in this direction a little bit. But it's not as scary as you think it's going to be. And I understand it stinks to lose an election. I've been there. And I may not make you a Biden supporter, but I'm going to be a president that you're proud of. So let's put Wednesday behind us and let's move forward together. It was that hard. Instead, Wednesday was the night of broken glass. It was 9/11. It was the worst day in American history. It was an insurrection, a terrorist attack. More inflaming of tensions. I share this because Trump never took his Reichstag moment. Never took it with COVID. What happened on Wednesday is their Reichstag moment. They're taking it because they are really good at never letting a crisis go to waste. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, please make the American mind a part of your daily reading and your daily viewing. I'm relatively new to them over the past few months, and they're just wonderful. Matthew Peterson is the editor of The American Mind, and he's the vice president of education at the Claremont Institute. Mr. Peterson, how are you, sir?
Very good. Thanks so much for having me
Good to
on.
talk to you. My pleasure. So we just did a couple segments on language. And talked about how first this started out as a mob, and then a riot, and then a coup, and then an insurrection, and now a terrorist attack, and they only have genocide left to go. And I remember I was making this point on the radio the other day, and someone said, "Oh, Slater, arguing over semantics. That's all you're doing, and that's the last refuge of a dying argument," or something like that. Tell us why language matters and why it's important.
If you, some people remember this book called the Bible that a lot of people used to read. And in the beginning, one of the first things, the first task that human beings have is to name the animals, right? Man named all the animals, as the Bob Dylan song goes. And what's the significance of that? The significance is really, names shape our perception of things because we're not just talking about naming, we're talking about ideas, right? And so the way in which we see the world is influenced by the ideas, the education we have. So if you control the language, you control the way in which people see the world. And perhaps even more importantly, if you're a tyrant, you control the way in which everyone else can communicate about the world, which is really what you care about if you want power. And so this is a perfect example of it. It's a very dangerous example. The same people who are talking about how we need to decelerate are in fact accelerating as fast as possible through the use of language. And as they do that, it makes it impossible for people who disagree to communicate with each other and the rest of the world.
Give me an example of that last part, of how it makes it impossible to communicate.
Well, just as they're banning the actual infrastructure, right? They're kicking people off the actual technological infrastructure by which you communicate. They're kicking people off Twitter, et cetera. But, for instance, if you're in the office and you have a disagreement with your colleagues about the nature of what happened on January 6th, you disagree with it, but you don't think it was an insurrection, the more they start ratcheting up the language, the more all of a sudden you look like you're a nut, right? You're outside the mainstream, and you're marginalized because everyone knows it was X instead of Y. That's just the beginning of it, though. The deeper problem is when it comes to the miseducation of America is that, especially with the young, they don't even have the concepts by which to refute the other side, right? It's not even conceivable to them how you would refute the other side, because the words that they have to use, the ideas that they have, come from that other side and cut them off from any other kind of thought.
One thing I admire so much about Jordan Peterson is his precision of language. And I regret that I am a product of that public school system, and I feel ill-equipped with my language to think clearly and articulate as well as I need to, as well as these times demand. And I imagine it's only worse now. So I remember your last article, you talked about how instead of using language properly and thinking things through thoroughly, we teach kids to emote. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so they're prescribed forms of emoting, right? There's certain ways in which you're supposed to ritualistically express your emotions, and that's what persuasion really is at this point. It's a very dangerous situation, and unfortunately, I think we're just at the beginning of a very bumpy time for America. Here's the problem: we used to teach words in the context of reason, right? But people had passions, emotions, and then they had reason, and reason was your capacity to think about things and to kind of control yourself. And education, and old liberal arts education, real liberal arts education in the tradition, you would learn about words. You'd learn rhetoric, how to persuade people. You'd learn logic, right? How to argue from point A to point B. And these were, they're rigorously taught. But I have to tell you, this can be taught to kids in K through 12. In classical schools, which are, by the way, there's a small renaissance of classical schools throughout America, where if you have kids, I suggest looking into it at least. These schools are trying to bring that back. You can teach it to anyone, right? The liberal arts were like broad skills involving reason and words that everyone was supposed to know if they were going to be an educated person. And you can do that in K through 12. We don't do any of this, of course. We do the opposite. We validate feelings as long as they go along with, the right narrative. And this is literally destroying America. This is the problem.
I would say I was a product of a school system, that public school system, that didn't even try to teach reason. But now kids today are taught to actively against. You're like that's racist to use reason, and all the other things that we've seen are white supremacist in our culture today: merit, hard work, showing up on time, reason, etc. Okay, so let's say we lived in a rational world. What would Wednesday or the aftermath of Wednesday, like this last week, have looked like instead of what it has been?
Well, how rational of a world are we talking? I would say at the very base level, what we would have seen in a sensible world is a lot of discussion about what actually happened and why, right? And there would be disagreement about that, but we would be actually citing, for instance, the president's words and trying to tie them, if you were against him, to inciting something. We would be waiting for facts about what exactly happened, right? What were the events of that day? And we would have some expectation that, our media would figure this out, and that there would be enough balance at the very least that we would know, we'd get a good sense of what actually happened, and everything would be ratcheted way down. Right. But we're so far away from that. For instance, a reasonable person should be able to say, okay, if they're against Trump, they should be able to say, well, I understand why his supporters are angry, because in context to the last 9 months, everyone who's blaming him has used similar language, and that would make people very, very upset. You see a few figures do that publicly, but in general, this is a real tragedy for our nation. The reaction to what happened. It's really sad when all of a sudden you go from you go to an insurrection and you start using this incendiary language. And of course, the irony is that this is exactly what they're blaming the other side for doing. They're ratcheting everything up to the max. And of course, that makes people very upset as they put the screws on everyone else. And that's the point.
The phrase we used the other day is they infantilize everyone and catastrophize everything. And just ratchet up it all. So what do we do moving forward, Matthew? What do we as conservatives, or what do we do? Especially, we've talked obviously a lot about Twitter and Parler and social media and all that stuff. I've heard this term like decentralize. We need to decentralize. I don't even really know what that means. How do we disconnect? We can't even use the right language. We can't even agree on things that happened and to use the right terms. So what are we as conservatives supposed to do moving forward here?
Well, I do think that it's vital for anyone who cares about the fate of America at this point to think deeply and act on a decentralization in a variety of respects. So my phrase is new tech, new media, and red states. We really need to. The only institution that the right really has are some of the red states. And, frankly, the leadership there has often been lazy in the past. We need strong leadership in red states. And we're going to need people to decentralize the internet. Digital technology actually does allow for this. Digital technology does allow for really new networks and new kinds of networks. And there are lots of people working on this. They weren't working on it fast enough. But my hope is that in the next year, you're really just going to see an acceleration of new forms of communication and technology. And here's why. The demand is there. Half the country plus wants to get off of these legacy media. Not even just people on the right. There's all kinds of people who have said, wait, I can actually use something that's private and I can control my data. I would love to do that, right? So they're going to fight hard, and it's not going to be easy. But there's a lot of people that I am in touch with and even working with who are trying to develop this technology, and that will allow for forms of media that speak out against the narrative. So it's almost like a race. As they become more tyrannical, we now have to accelerate new technology and new media. And the good news is that since it's so pronounced, and you have half of the nation as a market, there's so much potential to actually make that happen, right? Just monetarily, right? I mean, that's a huge market. There's demand, right? So I think that there's a lot of money and talent that hasn't really been engaged that's about to become engaged in this effort. There's also a lot of people moving to places in the interior of the country to work together on it.
Wow. I need to think about what our world looks like here without Twitter and Facebook and these big legacy media companies. I guess you call them legacy now. Social media companies. We need to decouple from them. But so what's the problem? Let's outline the problem. What's the problem with being tied to them still? And then what's the benefit of decentralizing and decoupling from them?
Well, I mean, the main problem everyone's talking about is they can control who speaks and who doesn't, right? And they really have no responsibility. I was, for instance, banned from Facebook. I have no idea why for a month. I wasn't sharing crazy articles or anything like that. I hadn't even used it in a while, and they must have retroactively looked at what I did in the past, and they're tightening the screws, and somehow they banned me. I have no idea why. That's not just annoying. That's dangerous when you start taking away voices. So that's the problem people have. But there's a deeper problem, and the deeper problem is they're extracting from you. I mean, their business model is to sell your information. So you get on there for free, but they're selling you, and they're doing that for many years, collecting your data. No one really likes that. So and that's not healthy, right? That they have this data about America in mass, and they're using it to try to then sell it to people who will manipulate you. The simpler way is just to be able to control all that. So think about all the pictures you have, all the emails and the stuff you write is all in the hands of third parties. That's kind of weird, right? I mean, it would have been considered weird up until a little while ago. Your personal family photos are in the cloud, controlled by a monstrous-sized company that gets most of its money or from overseas and doesn't even have America, in its interest. That's weird. So what would be normal is if you had a system more like the early internet, where you would have your computer and you'd call into another computer and talk to each other, but everything on your computer you owned, right? So you make it so that there's smaller networks of people banding together to use server space, at the very least that you have your own cloud, your own storage locker, and you got a lock to that, and you keep your stuff in it. And then, you can go out and use these other programs, but you're in charge of all your stuff. And you have, I hope if we're lucky, if we do this right, you have more and more control of that data, and then you can choose whether or not you want to sell it yourself. There's a browser called Brave that tries to move in this direction. And I think, people will be, Brendan Eich actually founded. So Brave is something to try out. But there's people moving in this direction. I think right now you have millions of people who are seeking these products that don't exist yet. And one of the things that I'm doing the next year is make sure that we connect the people working on solving this problem with the American public that wants to use these products.
And we are all in. Braves, was that founded by the guy who was kicked out of Mozilla for supporting traditional marriage?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Amazing.
He ended up founding the company. It's very interesting.
And I thought on top of that, it's so odd that I provide content for Facebook and they don't pay me. I'm giving these guys my free labor for their enrichment. That's insane. We got to go, Matthew, but real quick, you sent a tweet about how even out of the social media internet world, we need new trade associations of realigned business interests and organizations that workers that actually accomplish what the old unions did. What would that look like? What's your thinking there?
So what's the obstacle? The obstacle are large corporations that really increasingly do not have America in mind as part of the equation. What's good for America in mind and what's good for the American worker in mind when they make their calculus. And conservatives used to be on the side of big business because they felt what was good for Ford is good for America. But of course, if you think about Google, is what's good for Google good for America? It's not so clear. So how do you strike back? We're not going to win if we just have an argument about words in a landscape that's dominated and controlled by the left. We're going to have to take action. Well, how does the left take action? How do they put pressure on us, right? What do they do? Well, remember, when they don't like a law in Georgia, they'll say, we're taking business out of Georgia. We're going to strike, right? We're going to boycott you, red state. And there's going to be a lot more of that to come. They're not going to stop doing this. So there's all kinds of business interests, especially medium-sized and small businesses, that are getting absolutely hosed by the left in various ways. And there's also larger interests that are much more, American-based that also oppose the left. So we need to counter the left's efforts to bully the big businesses, to bully us with other businesses that can strike back and make threats to blue states and say, look, if you don't change this ridiculous policy, we're not going to ship our stuff to your state, right? The red counties in California, for instance, the reason that the state will never let them go is because they provide water, right? A very basic reason. Now, the left will threaten boycotts. We need to do the same. But in order to do that, we have to have organization. And I really think there's a chance for us to become a pro-worker party that's still free market, of course, but that's pro-worker. And that means we do need trade associations and groups that protect workers against these large interests that have become increasingly political and increasingly stand against red state America.
Ton more to talk about there. And in California, the blue counties will withhold fire protection funding from the red counties. And again, the red counties do nothing in return. All right, Matthew, we got to talk again. There's a ton here, obviously. I'm super grateful for you. And I'm telling you, everyone, please make The American Mind one of, if you're not, your very first thing you read in the morning. They're on the forefront. Matthew, appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. Okay. There's a ton happening here. I want to wrap up this show here with talking about the meta-narrative is the technical term for this. Do you remember what the left has done the last year or so with our founding fathers, right? They changed 1776 to 1619. They moved our national consciousness of 1776 with good feelings, right? And we liked the founding of our country, right? Founded in God, with liberty, justice for all, and it was like a good positive thing. Let's go have a parade. And they've redefined America's founding with bad feelings. 1619, it's about racism and hatred and bigotry and slavery. We're an evil, racist country at our core. We were at our founding, we still are today. And that's what's being taught to your kids at school today. And the left was able to do this in a year, right? With this 1619 project, the New York Times, the main author won the Pulitzer Prize for it. They're doing a very similar trick today. In this segment, I want to talk about how the left is writing a fiction. They're writing a fiction to justify what they want to do next. John Favreau is the former main speechwriter for Barack Obama. He hosts, I think he's the host of the podcast Pod Save America. I think that's him, and I think it's like one of the top podcasts in the country. He wrote on Twitter the other day, he said, "It is without question." Now, this is a man who knows language. He understands nuance, and he is using none of it here. It is without question the most evil, dangerous behavior exhibited by any American president in history. And there must be accountability. That's the catastrophizing that we've been talking about. Everything is the worst, always. Everything is Hitler. But it's even worse than just being melodramatic. The thesis for the last couple of days has been the more extreme the characterization of the event, the more extreme the remedial action they say is going to be necessary to solve it. This is why, as we talked about in the last segment, they've raised the stakes. They ratcheted up, as Matthew said, from coup to insurrection and now terrorist attack. There's this guy, Ali. I don't care for him. But he was one of the leaders of Stop the Steal. Twitter not only banned him, PayPal, Venmo, Cash App, cut him out. I'm sure there's others too, right? Probably every tech company completely distanced themselves from him. We're hearing this today as well that Trump, two banks have cut ties with Trump. One of them closed their accounts. It was like $5.3 million. They closed their accounts from Donald Trump. It's amazing what these tech companies and banks are doing here. They're deleting people from existence because he's a terrorist now. And if you're a terrorist, you can never go too far. The only rhetorical step, like the rhetorical escalation, is to call this, what happened on Wednesday, a genocide. Right? Go from terrorist attack to genocide. But I wouldn't put it past them. I'm keeping my eyes out for some article where they talk about how this was a genocide. And they'll do like, the white supremacist actions at the Capitol reminded this nation of how racist we are and how deep the genocide of black bodies is in this country, or something like that, right? Every day that goes on, every day the media and the left make what happened at the Capitol more and more than what it was. And here's what's going to happen. People will start to remember it as more than it was. And pretty soon conventional wisdom will be that the entire legislative branch just narrowly escaped mass execution at the hands of the president's army. You always hear it described as an army of Trump supporters, right? You never hear like an army of Black Lives Matter protesters. There's always an army of Trump supporters with guns, murder, right? That's how people will remember. We did a segment on the radio last week, and I think we did on the TV, but we may have to do deeper of this, about memory and how our memories are terrible. Our memories are not a video camera that we just set to record and then we go back and we rewatch the tape. Our memories are created. We may remember a detail, but the rest of it is entirely reconstructed after the fact. Oftentimes, this is pieces of different things that have happened we kind of put together into one cohesive story. Very few people were in DC last Wednesday. So everyone's making up their own movie of what actually happened, and they're doing it to fit their own agenda in the end. It's entirely made up in our heads. And that's the key. It's all done to fit their set agenda that's already been set out. And the left is doing this, making it more and more and more and more, literally to the point where people will think that there were people with guns and legislatures were tied up and almost died and hostages were taken. People will actually think that. They're going to be successful. They've been able to make President Trump a Nazi for the last 4 years. And people believe that. They're also going to be able to define what happened last Wednesday as a genocide in order to justify whatever extreme remedy they can conceive of. So James Lindsay calls this a meta-narrative. It's the left's meta-narrative. First, America was not founded on freedom in 1776. We were founded in slavery in 1619. And in 2021, we finally defeat the Nazi white supremacists in America. We finally defeat the white supremacist terrorists in America. America was not founded on slavery in 1619. Trump was not a Nazi. Those are poisonous distortions, which will result in horrific remedies moving forward. Was what happened at the Capitol bad? Yeah, of course. Was it an unprecedented coup? No. Was it a terrorist attack? No. They voted an hour later in the same building. We went from a riot that a mob whipped into a frenzy, as mobs are wont to do, storming the Capitol, and an hour later being escorted out. And by the way, it never would have happened if there was proper security. And there was an effort intentionally to not have appropriate amounts of security. The whole thing could have been avoided. And now it's the worst thing that's happened since the War of 1812. It's a Nazi coup. And that with COVID are all the justification that are necessary to change the entire direction of this country. That's what the left wants. The left is whipping everyone up into thinking that Trump's going to launch nuclear weapons any minute now, right? Oh, we got to impeach him. We got to remove him from office. It's not safe. Really trying to milk these last 8 days. But this is how the left thinks. This is how they view it. Don't let them redefine what Wednesday was, because they're going to use it. They've weaponized it. They're weaponizing it. In their mind, it's been 401 years since the founding of this evil, racist country in 1619. And this is the year that we finally triumph over evil. Triumphing over evil. How have people triumphed over evil in the past? Through discussion, through dialogue, through debate, through compromise. That's the left right now. Never letting a crisis go to waste. Tomorrow we'll talk about how social media, we're going to go more into Matthew Peterson's point about decentralizing, decoupling, getting off social media, what that looks like. What do we do instead? And I want to talk about the dehumanizing that social media has been doing for a decade now. And it's about time we say enough. Talk about that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.